They called me worthless, and when my grandfather gave me $50,000 to invest and later changed his will to benefit me, my father tried to ruin my company secretly. I've never really caught anyone's attention unless it was for the wrong reasons. Raised in what seemed like a dream setting, wealthy parents, a mansion in the upscale suburbs of Boston, private schools, I had everything a child could desire. But appearances can be deceiving. From my birth, it was evident to all, particularly to my parents, Rebecca and Charles Turner, that I was a letdown. They had longed for a daughter, meticulously planning her life with visions of ballet recitals and elegant dresses, hoping she would mirror their own cultivated personas and uphold their upper-class values. However, the arrival of me, Alexander, or Alex for short, shattered their perfect dream. Complicating matters, my mother's delivery was fraught with difficulties, leaving her unable to have more children. Growing up, I was acutely aware that not only did I not meet their expectations in terms of gender, but I was also their only chance at parenthood. They never explicitly shared their disappointment with me, but the chill of it permeated every interaction. Our home in Brookline, just outside Boston, was more a cold museum than a family house. It boasted pristine lawns, a swimming pool, tennis courts, and a vast, untouched nursery that my mother couldn't bring herself to change. I spent my childhood in overly spacious rooms filled with uninviting, gleaming surfaces that seemed to fear my touch, as though my presence alone might taint their perfection. Walking through these rooms, I always felt like an intruder in my own life. By the age of 5, I was already attending a private kindergarten. Unlike my classmates whose parents eagerly awaited them, I was collected by a chauffeur. I still recall standing there watching other kids leap into warm embraces while I lingered in the towering shadow of the school building, waiting for the family driver to appear. Whenever other parents encountered mine, they were invariably impressed. Rebecca and Charles Turner epitomized the ideal couple. Mom was the epitome of elegance, always with her hair perfectly styled and dressed in tailor-made outfit. Dad exuded the aura of a classic business titan, his suits so expensive they might surpass many people's annual rent. Externally, we appeared to be the perfect family, but within the confines of our mansion, the reality was starkly different. Things deteriorated further after my early childhood. At just 6 years old, without any say in the matter, I was sent away to a boarding school in Connecticut. Their decision was devoid of warmth or consideration. I distinctly recall my mother's chilling justification. "It's better for him. It's what boys like him need." It felt as though I was merely a defective gadget that required repair, not their son. This school was strategically distant, ensuring I was out of sight and mind except during the holidays, which quickly lost any semblance of joy. My returns home were marked by profound indifference from my parents, to the point where I began to dread those supposedly festive times. The boarding school mirrored the coldness of my home. My peers, like my parents, were shaped by their wealth and the belief that showing emotion was a sign of weakness. I struggled to connect with them. There was something about me that they instinctively rejected. Perhaps it was my lack of arrogance, or maybe it was because I had never truly experienced familial warmth. Whatever the reason, I quickly became the outcast, the boy who was easy to overlook, or worse, to target for cruelty. Amid this harsh environment, there was one ray of warmth: my grandfather, James Turner. Unlike my parents, he was a self-made man who had witnessed the Turner family's ascent from modest beginnings. Residing in a simple home on Cape Cod, he embodied a stark contrast to the grandeur I was accustomed to. He hadn't merely inherited his status, but had earned it when the Turner name was still unremarkable. To him, I was more than the disappointment my parents saw. I was his grandson, someone worthy of love and attention. My grandfather never minded that I was a boy. When he learned I was being sent to boarding school, he made it a point to visit as often as he could. His visits were like a lifeline. He would pull me from the sterile, oppressive environment of the school, and we'd spend time together, fishing off the Cape or walking through the serene forest near his home. He was the only one who genuinely asked about my well-being and cared about my responses. One summer, when I was around 9, he invited me to spend a month with him on the Cape. My parents readily agreed, almost relieved to be unburdened of my presence. That month was a rare breath of fresh air during my childhood. His house, though aged and worn, felt alive, a stark contrast to our lifeless mansion. I still remember the salty sea breeze wafting through the windows, the distant calls of seagulls, and the comforting creak of the floorboards underfoot. My grandfather devoted hours to teaching me sailing, a skill he cherished from his youth. Those days on the water, surrounded only by the wind and waves, symbolized pure freedom. But inevitably, the summer ended. My parents collected me, their usual indifference swiftly reinstating the status quo. The warmth of my grandfather's care dissipated as I returned to school, sinking back into my isolated existence. As the years passed, the chasm between my parents and me only widened. My mother immersed herself in charity events and social engagements to uphold her status among Boston's elite, while my father disappeared into his work. Contact with him was rare, and even then, he was either too preoccupied or too exhausted to engage. By my teenage years, I had given up on seeking their attention. Life became a monotonous cycle: school, uneventful holidays at home where I felt practically invisible, and the occasional cherished visit from my grandfather. He remained my sole lifeline, the only one who still made an effort to connect, even as his health began to decline when I was 16. The effort it took him to visit started to take its toll, and I could see each trip weighing heavier on him. Despite his declining health, my grandfather continued his visits. One particularly memorable day wasn't exceptional for its activities, but for its normalcy. I was 17, home for the holidays during my senior year of high school, and as had become customary, my parents barely acknowledged me. But the day after Christmas, my grandfather picked me up for lunch. We ended up at a small cafe by the water, doing nothing more than chatting about life. Yet, it was in that simplicity, sitting across from him, that I realized he was my only true familial connection. Tragically, that lunch was the last time I saw him. He passed away a few months later, leaving me utterly devastated. His death felt like losing my sole anchor in a vast sea of indifference. My parents' reaction, or lack thereof, to his passing was cold. My father dealt with the estate, but emotionally, it was as if nothing had happened, as if a man crucial to my very being had vanished without affecting anyone else. His absence left me more isolated than ever. Without him, there was no one to turn to during tough times, and my parents continued their lives unaffected. But for me, everything had changed. It was then that I made a definitive decision to leave. I couldn't remain in Boston, suffocated by their expectations and disdain. I applied to universities as far away as possible and accepted an offer from a school in California. Leaving Boston felt like I was stepping out of a cage. However, as I moved across the country to forge my own path, the emotional scars from my upbringing lingered. Despite their wealth and influence providing everything materially conceivable, my parents had never given me what I truly needed: love. With my grandfather gone, it was even difficult to recall what love felt like. My departure for college marked the severing of the final ties with my parents. My acceptance into Harvard University, my father's alma mater, was expected by everyone but felt like a hollow victory to me. I had earned my place, yet I knew that our family's legacy and wealth had played a role, something my father didn't hesitate to remind me. It felt like another chain, a persistent reminder that no matter my efforts, they could always attribute my achievements to their influence. Despite the emotional void in my upbringing, I always had a knack for numbers. In a household where emotions were suppressed, I found comfort in the certainty of finance and economics, fields where numbers provided clear, unambiguous truths. They were reliable, devoid of the emotional disappointments I had grown accustomed to at home. Upon entering Harvard, I resolved to leverage my affinity for numbers to carve out my own path distinct from the empty legacy constructed by my parents. Harvard presented a microcosm of the elite, a place bustling with the heirs of substantial fortunes and established legacies. While many of my peers seemed to naturally assume their roles within their familial echelons, I felt out of place with such expectations. I was not at Harvard to perpetuate the Turner reach. I was there to break away from it. By my junior year, my interest in finance, particularly the stock market, intensified. I was captivated by the way fortunes were made and lost at the drop of a hat, by the precision of strategic trading, and how a deep understanding of this realm conferred immense power. This fascination drove me into an intensive study of finance, sparking a passion that surpassed any academic endeavor I had previously undertaken. However, it wasn't merely instinct driving me. It was a deep-seated desire to prove that I could succeed independently. The defining moment came when I invested using funds from a trust set up by my grandfather, James Turner, before his passing. While the trust wasn't as extensive as my parents' wealth, it was significant enough. He had always emphasized that this money was meant for building a future, not for squandering. Withdrawing $50,000 from that trust marked the beginning of my true independence. This money was not just another extension of my father's wealth or a handout from my parents. It was a legacy from my grandfather meant to seed my own ventures. I started cautiously, opting for stable blue chip stocks, and meticulously monitored the market's every pulse, absorbing every piece of related literature I could find. As my obsession with the markets grew, my academic performance began to wane, but that did not deter me. I was convinced that my future did not lie in scholarly recognition, but in mastering the intricacies of finance. Gradually, as my confidence in my financial acumen grew, I ventured into more speculative investments. Each decision was calculated and backed by exhaustive research, ensuring I was not acting recklessly but strategically expanding my portfolio. As the months passed, my portfolio steadily grew. By the time I graduated from Harvard, my initial $50,000 had transformed into $300,000. While it wasn't a monumental figure in the grand scheme of finance, for me, it was proof that I could thrive on my own terms. More importantly, I had built it entirely without any assistance from my parents. I didn't share this success with them. In fact, our communication during those years was minimal. They had little interest in my endeavors unless it impacted their image, and I was perfectly content to keep them at a distance. During my final year at Harvard, however, the dynamics between my parents and me began to shift. My father, Charles, had quietly been working on expanding his business into the financial sector. Traditionally focused on real estate, he saw the shifting markets as an opportunity to branch out into investments. The problem was finance wasn't his area of expertise. He hired consultants and brokers to handle the new ventures, but from what I gathered through various connections, they weren't performing as expected. Despite his attempts to maintain a facade of success, cracks in his financial strategy began to show. The luxurious lifestyle my parents had always led was becoming harder to sustain. Though they weren't facing any immediate financial trouble, the pressure was mounting, and my father's pride wouldn't allow him to admit to any shortcoming. Around this time, I crossed paths with a classmate named David Cray. While we weren't particularly close, there was a mutual respect between us, especially for each other's financial instincts. Like me, David came from a wealthy family, but he wasn't content to simply live off that fortune. He had spent our college years dabbling in venture capital and startups, building an impressive portfolio of tech companies along the way. During our senior year, David and I began having more serious conversations. He had noticed my success in the stock market and was intrigued by my investment approach. One day, he pitched an idea to me, an idea he believed could revolutionize everything. He wanted to start an investment firm, something that would capitalize on the booming tech market and the rapid growth of startups in Silicon Valley. And he wanted me to join him. At first, I hesitated. I had been focused on building my own portfolio and wasn't sure if I was ready to dive into something so ambitious. At first, I wasn't sure I wanted to tie myself to someone else's venture. But David was persistent. And the more we talked, the more I realized that this might be the opportunity I had been waiting for. It wasn't just about making money, it was about building something new, something that could challenge the traditional financial powerhouses like my father's company and beat them at their own game. After graduation, we spent the summer meticulously planning and assembling our team. By fall, Cray Turner Investments was officially launched. I put in $200,000 of my own money, while David secured funding from his family and some well-connected investors. It was a big risk, but one I was ready to take. The early days were tough. We were young, ambitious, and unproven. In the eyes of the financial world, we were just another group of privileged kids trying to play in the big leagues. But we knew what we were doing. We started small, zeroing in on early-stage tech companies that had the potential for explosive growth. Hours were spent meeting with founders, analyzing startups, and poring over market trends. Our first few investments didn't deliver massive returns, but they were steady enough to keep us afloat and prove that we weren't just playing around. Then, in our second year, we struck gold. We invested heavily in a startup called Innovatech, a small tech firm with a promising new piece of software. While others overlooked them, we saw the potential. We made a bold move, betting big on Innovatech, and within a year, their valuation skyrocketed. Our initial $500,000 investment transformed into $5 million almost overnight. That success was the breakthrough we desperately needed. Suddenly, Cray Turner Investments wasn't just another unknown firm. We were making waves. With the success of Innovatech, investors began to take us seriously. Capital started flowing in, and we expanded our portfolio rapidly. Within 3 years, Cray Turner Investments had grown into a $50 million firm. Though still small compared to Wall Street titans, we had agility and a sharp instinct for tech and innovation. My father, in particular, seemed to take my success as a personal insult. His own ventures in finance had continued to struggle, and I think my achievements served as a painful reminder of his failures. The breaking point came when Turner Real Estate Holdings, his company, hit a serious crisis. They had made several poor investments in international real estate, and the market had turned against them. Their cash flow was drying up, and they were bleeding money. Through mutual connections, I heard that they were on the verge of collapse. Then one evening, my father called me. It was the first time he had reached out in over a year, and the desperation in his voice was unmistakable. He asked to meet, and part of me wanted to refuse, to let him face the consequences of his arrogance and mismanagement. But another part, the part that had always sought his approval, even after everything, agreed. We met at an upscale restaurant in downtown Boston, a place my father often used to impress clients. When I walked in, I saw him seated at the table, looking older and more weary than I had ever seen him. He tried to project his usual air of authority, but I could tell he was struggling. He wasted no time telling me about the company's dire situation, how they were on the brink and needed a substantial capital injection to survive. He danced around the real issue for a while, but eventually, he laid it all out. He wanted me to bail him out. He was asking me, his son, the one he had ignored for most of my life, for help. I sat there, listening to his plea, my thoughts swirling. This was the man who had never shown me affection, who had only seen me as a disappointment, and now he needed a favor. It was almost laughable. Part of me wanted to reject him outright, to throw his request back in his face, but in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just about him. It was about me. It was about proving, not to him, but to myself, that I didn't need his approval or validation. I had built my own success, something he could never take credit for, and now I held the power to either save him or let him fail. I told him I would think about it. After that meeting, I agonized over the decision for days. I discussed it with David, who surprised me by saying we should go for it, not out of kindness, but because he saw an opportunity. If we stepped in, we could take control of Turner Real Estate Holdings and absorb it into Cray Turner Investments. It wasn't just about saving my father's company, it was about expanding ours. It was a cold, calculated business move, but one that could position us for significant gains in the long run. In the end, I agreed to help my father, but with a clear stipulation. I wanted a controlling stake in the company. At first, my father resisted, but faced with no other options, he eventually conceded. The day we signed the papers was the day I truly liberated myself from his shadow. I had saved his company, but it was on my terms. No longer the neglected son or the family disappointment. I was now the one in control. My parents continued living their lives as they always had, but things had changed. They could no longer ignore me or brush aside my success. It was undeniable now. For the first time, I felt like I was finally writing my own story, one that wasn't bound by their expectations or indifference. Looking back, I realized that every moment of neglect, every time I was cast aside, had led me to this point. I had built something real, something powerful, and I had done it without any help from them. In the end, my parents had only ever given me their indifference, but I had turned it into something far greater than they could have ever imagined. And as for my grandfather, I know he would have been proud. After taking control of Turner Real Estate Holdings, I believed I had finally cut the last emotional ties to my father. Cray Turner Investments was thriving, and I was focused entirely on its expansion. David Cray and I were making waves in the financial world, and our firm was quickly becoming a major player in tech investments. Yet, despite my efforts to leave the past behind, life had other. It was during a major investment conference that I met Emily Prescott. She was everything I hadn't expected in a partner: strong-willed, fiercely independent, and a brilliant investor. Coming from old money, her family ran a vast financial empire in London, and she had carved her own path by leading one of the largest venture capital firms on the East Coast. Emily was stunning, yes, but it was her intellect that truly captivated. In the cutthroat world of high finance, few people really understood the complexities the way she did. She shared the same hunger for success and the drive to build something from the ground up. Initially, our relationship was purely professional. We began working together on a few deals, combining our resources to back a promising tech startup that had caught both of our attention. But as the months passed, we grew closer. Our conversations moved beyond business, delving into our ambitions, frustrations, and the unique challenges of growing up in families where wealth was both a blessing and a burden. What began as collaboration turned into something deeper, something I never saw. Emily was unlike anyone I had ever met. She didn't need validation or approval from anyone, least of all her parents, and I admired that about her. I had spent so many years chasing my parents' impossible approval, but she had always forged her own path unapologetically. It was a breath of fresh air. It didn't take long for our professional relationship to evolve into something personal. We started seeing each other outside of work, and before long, we were inseparable. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had met someone who truly understood me on every level. Emily was as ambitious as I was, and soon we began discussing the possibility of merging not just our lives, but potentially even our businesses. Everything seemed to be falling into place, but life had other plans. In the months that followed, my father launched a series of legal challenges to contest my control of Turner Real Estate Holdings. He hired a team of high-powered attorneys to sift through every loophole and obscure legal technicality he could find, but my grandfather had been thorough when drafting his will, leaving little for my father to exploit. Still, he dragged me into court, forcing me to spend both time and money defending what was already rightfully mine. During this challenging period, my relationship with Emily deepened. She stood by me every step of the way, offering not only emotional support, but also her sharp legal and financial expertise. Her family had dealt with its own inheritance disputes, so she knew exactly how to navigate the traps my father was trying to set. Together, we built a strong defense, and it soon became apparent that my father was fighting a losing battle. But my father wasn't one to give up easily. When the legal route failed, he resorted to more underhanded tactics. He began using his remaining influence in the financial world to try to undermine my business. He spread rumors and planted seeds of doubt, suggesting that my success with Cray Turner Investments was nothing more than a stroke of luck, or worse, the product of nepotism. At first, I tried to ignore it, but as the rumors started, and then there was Emily. In his desperation, my father shifted his focus toward her, hoping to drive a wedge between us. He knew that if he couldn't ruin my business, he might succeed in damaging my relationship. He began reaching out to people within Emily's social circle, spreading lies about me and planting seeds of doubt. He even went so far as to imply that I was only with her for her connections, suggesting I was using her to elevate my standing in the financial world. But Emily wasn't easily manipulated. She saw through my father's schemes, and rather than driving us apart, his efforts only brought us closer. We spent countless hours talking about our future, both personally and professionally. Emily wasn't just my partner in life, she was my partner in business. Together, we were an unstoppable force. My father's attempts to destroy me came to a head when he attempted a hostile takeover of Cray Turner Investments. Using what little influence he had left, he rallied a group of investors and tried to buy up shares of my company in a last-ditch effort to seize control. It was a desperate move, and it might have succeeded if Emily and I hadn't been prepared. We had anticipated something like this and had been quietly securing additional shares in the company, ensuring that no one could take control without our consent. When my father's plan unraveled, it backfired spectacularly. His investors pulled out, realizing that his actions were motivated by little more than a personal vendetta. His reputation, already fragile, was shattered. In the end, my father lost everything. Turner Real Estate Holdings collapsed under the weight of bad investments and failed ventures. His legal challenges against my grandfather's will were dismissed, and he was left with nothing, not even his pride, which had been crushed in the process. As for me, I emerged stronger. With Emily by my side, we continued to grow Cray Turner Investments, expanding into new markets and building the kind of empire that would have made my grandfather proud. We weathered every storm my father threw at us, and in the end, we came out on top. In the quiet moments, I often think about my grandfather and what he would have thought about all that had happened. He had always believed in me, even when no one else did. Now, standing at the helm of a thriving company with a partner who both understood and supported me, I knew I had finally realized the potential he had always seen in me. My father had tried to ruin me, but in the end, it was his own arrogance and greed that led to his downfall. I had risen from the ashes of my family's fractured legacy, free at last to build my future. After his failed takeover attempt and the collapse of Turner Real Estate Holdings, I thought he was finally finished. Defeated, exposed, and weakened, I believed Charles Turner would retreat into the shadows. But I should have known better. My father was never the type to accept defeat, and he wasn't about to start now, especially when he believed his legacy was on the line. What I didn't realize at the time was just how far he was willing to go in his desperation. He was prepared to employ the same ruthless tactics that had ruined so many others before him. In the wake of his public humiliation, I assumed his influence was all but gone. His reputation in the financial world had been irreparably tarnished, and his power had all but evaporated. But rather than admit defeat, my father did what he did best. He adapted, and his next move would prove to be the most dangerous of all. It started slowly. I began hearing whispers in the industry about a handful of small investment firms that had sprung up almost overnight. Each one was operating in the same markets as Cray Turner Investments. Initially, I didn't give them much thought. The financial world is full of new players trying to make their mark. But as time passed, I noticed something unsettling. These firms weren't acting independently. They were targeting our investments. The first major warning sign came when Innovatech, a star performer in our portfolio, began to falter unexpectedly. Everything had been going smoothly, and they were on the brink of releasing a groundbreaking new product. But suddenly, they faced a series of setbacks. Regulatory delays, the abrupt withdrawal of a key investor, and lawsuits from seemingly unrelated third parties. It was chaos, and it was costing us millions. As I started digging deeper, I noticed a disturbing pattern. These mysterious firms had been quietly buying up shares in our key investments, undermining our influence and strategically positioning themselves to destabilize us. It was as if someone was orchestrating a coordinated attack on our firm, someone with intimate knowledge of our portfolio, someone who knew exactly where to strike, and that someone could only be my father. Then it all clicked. This wasn't a random group of investors. This was my father's doing. Classic Charles Turner, silent, relentless, and willing to use any means necessary to get what he wanted. Unable to take down Cray Turner Investments directly, he had concocted a web of front companies all designed to attack us from the shadows. He was funneling what remained of his resources into these ventures, turning them into weapons aimed at dismantling my business piece by piece. I should have seen it coming. My father had spent his entire career mastering the art of manipulation, and this was his final gambit. He wasn't just targeting my company, he was trying to erase everything I had worked so hard to build. And if I didn't act swiftly, he might actually succeed. Determined to fight back, I assembled a team of forensic accountants and private investigators to trace the links between these firms and my father. It wasn't easy. He had meticulously hidden his tracks, using offshore accounts and shell corporations to mask his involvement. But after months of painstaking research, we uncovered the truth. Every one of these shadow companies could be traced back to him. The level of financial fraud he had orchestrated was staggering. With the evidence in hand, I knew I had to act. My father hadn't just crossed ethical lines, he had broken the law. He was manipulating the market, committing securities fraud, and exploiting insider information. This wasn't just a personal vendetta, it was a crime. And this time, I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I filed a lawsuit against my father and his network of front companies, charging him with securities fraud, market manipulation, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. What followed was nothing short of an all-out legal war. As expected, my father denied everything, hiring an army of top-tier lawyers to challenge my claims and discredit me. But the evidence we had built was overwhelming. And as the case progressed, the depth of his wrongdoing came to light. The trial became a media sensation, a son suing his father, the collapse of a once powerful financial dynasty under the weight of its own corruption. My father's legal team argued that he had done nothing wrong, claiming he was merely a savvy businessman making calculated moves within the system. But as the details of his deceit and fraud unraveled, it was clear to everyone that this went far beyond business strategy. It was a deliberate attempt to undermine not just me, but the integrity of the entire financial market. The documents we uncovered painted a very different picture than my father's narrative. His front companies had engaged in fraudulent trading, manipulating stock prices through pump and dump schemes, and using insider information to tilt the markets in his favor. The trial dragged on for months, each day revealing more of the intricate web my father had woven. There were times when I could hardly comprehend the lengths he had gone to in his quest to ruin me. This wasn't just about business or money for him. It was deeply personal. To him, I was the one who had stripped away the empire he believed was rightfully his. As the trial unfolded, the case against him became increasingly airtight. Prosecutors meticulously laid out how my father had used his network of front companies to manipulate stock prices, not just to target Cray Turner Investments, but also other firms he had set his sights on. Investors had been defrauded of millions, and his crimes were too severe to overlook. The turning point came when one of his closest associates, Robert Lane, agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. Lane had been instrumental in setting up the front companies, and his testimony was the final nail in the coffin. He exposed my father's entire plan, detailing how he had used his remaining power and influence to manipulate the markets and orchestrate my downfall. The jury didn't need much time to deliberate. They returned a verdict. My father was found guilty on multiple counts of securities fraud, conspiracy, and market manipulation. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in federal prison, a harsh but fitting penalty for the damage he had caused. As I sat in the courtroom listening to the sentence being read, I felt a strange blend of emotions. Relief, certainly, knowing my father would finally face justice for his actions. But there was also a profound sadness. Despite everything, he was still my father, and now I was watching him being led away in handcuffs. Even in defeat, my father couldn't let go of his pride. He refused to look at me, refused to accept responsibility for the destruction he had caused. As he was escorted out, he lashed out with a final, desperate attempt to rewrite history. He shouted that he had been manipulated by my mother for years, that she had poisoned him against me because she had never forgiven me for being born a boy. It was a weak, hollow excuse, an attempt to shift blame for choices that were entirely his own. The truth was undeniable. My father had been consumed by his own ambition, and in the end, it was that same ambition that had destroyed him. His need for control and refusal to accept his failures had been his undoing. With my father now behind bars, I finally felt the weight lift. But the battle had left scars. The mounting legal fees, the relentless stress, and the constant media scrutiny had all taken their toll. Through it all, though, Emily had stood firmly by my side. She had been my anchor, guiding me through the complexities of the trial and offering support when I needed it the most. As we stood together watching the fall of my father's empire, I realized that we had come through the flames stronger than ever. After the trial, Cray Turner Investments rebounded, more resilient than before. The exposure of my father's fraudulent schemes had ironically boosted our reputation. The world saw us as a firm that had survived one of the biggest financial scandals, built on integrity and perseverance. Investors flocked to us, eager to align themselves with a company that had weathered such a storm. Our portfolio surged, and soon we were managing billions in assets. Emily and I continued to grow together, both personally and professionally. We merged our firms, creating a financial powerhouse that spanned both coasts. Together, we ventured into new markets, investing in renewable energy, healthcare, and emerging technology. Every decision was calculated and strategic, and success followed us. In the financial world, we became the couple everyone looked up to, partners in life and business. Yet, even as I moved forward, there were moments when I couldn't shake my father's final words from my mind. His claim that my mother had manipulated him, that she was the one driving his actions, those words echoed in my thoughts. I didn't know if there was any truth to it. My mother had always been distant, cold, and emotionally absent. But had she really been behind my father's decisions? Or was he simply trying to shift the blame one last time? I never got the answers. After the trial, my mother withdrew from public life, retreating to one of the family's European estates. We hadn't spoken in years, and I doubted we ever would. She had always been more of a shadow in my life, a presence felt, but never seen. Now she had faded away completely. As for my father, he quietly served his time. There were no appeals, no efforts to reduce his sentence. He simply vanished into the system, becoming just another fallen figure brought down by his own greed. I visited him once just before his release. The meeting was brief and awkward, marked by his refusal to even look me in the eye. He never apologized, never acknowledged the destruction he caused. Even in his broken state, he clung to the belief that he had been wronged, convinced that I had somehow stolen what should have been his. After his release from prison, he disappeared, leaving behind only the remnants of his once powerful empire. I don't know where he went, and to be honest, I don't care. My life had moved forward, and so had I. In the end, My father's downfall taught me a lesson far more valuable than any financial success. True success isn't measured by wealth or power, but by the people you surround yourself with and the principles you stand by. My grandfather had always understood this, and in his quiet way, he tried to instill that in me. It took years of struggle, years of battling with my parents, but I had finally grasped the lesson. Emily and I had built something real, something enduring. We built it on a foundation of integrity, trust, and partnership. Together, we created a legacy, one that would carry the Turner name forward, not through the corruption and greed my father embodied, but through the values my grandfather had passed on to me. In the end, I didn't just win, I created a life that was genuinely mine, and that more than anything was the greatest victory of all.